Okay, so I get this task to write about Graceland. What do I have to say that hasn't been said? It's such for me, if I did my job, when you read that book, the monuments are incidental, that you'll think of it as a landscape, as you might think about Central Park. So there's very little attention, say, from my hero Sullivan, to monuments. But the conventional wisdom was that Graceland Cemetery was designed by O.C. Simons, and it represents the Prairie School. And the fact is, nothing could be further from the truth. So I set out not to sort of intentionally debunk anything, but I thought certainly there's more to it than that. Well, the whole idea of it originated with a Virginia attorney, Thomas Barber Bryan, who graduated from Harvard and then came via Cincinnati to Chicago in 1852. Importantly, Bryan had a very much a philanthropic side, and most of his endeavors set out to prove that making beauty and making money aren't mutually exclusive. So Bryan's building these mansions, are developing in Elmhurst, and then in 1855, Bryan has an infant son that dies, and he has to go bury him in the city cemetery, then in Lincoln Park. And he goes there, and it's a hole. I mean, it's just atrocious. He thinks it's the ugliest thing he's ever seen. And whilst he buries him in the city cemetery for the time being, it puts the idea in his head that, maybe I can do a cemetery. Well, then he goes up to Lakeview, and he has this whole covert operation where he doesn't want anyone to know what he's doing, all right, because he's scared to death that the neighbors are going to go, I don't want all these dead bodies next to me, so then my value of my house will go down. Well, then there's one of Chicago's early landscape gardeners, a fellow named Swain Nelson, who comes to Lakeview, and this is the home of James Waller, and he sees a new home being constructed, and approaches Waller, and he says, do you need a landscape gardener? He says, yes. He says, but I got another project for you. He says, I've heard rumors that Thomas Bryan is going to buy this land and make a cemetery. Could you go find out for me? So he sends Swain Nelson to go eavesdrop, etc., and Bryan hires him, etc., and they go ahead, and Nelson gets a job to look at Graceland. So it's kind of interesting in the sense that he's sort of becoming the double agent, if you will. All right, so we've got Swain Nelson, and he's kind of on the job, but something happens, and essentially Nelson is kind of little experienced, and he's not quite the slick professional, and I think Bryan, we're going to have a prestigious name, he approaches this fellow in the left named William Saunders, who had been involved with the design of Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And he would go on, his greatest project was this military cemetery Gettysburg. Well, Saunders comes to Chicago in 1859 for a number of things. One thing, there's another cemetery, Rose Hill, that's sort of the first cab off the rank, and so they had hired Saunders, and so he was in Chicago, and he actually came and visited Bryan and Elmhurst, etc. But he had also done the plan for Calvary Cemetery, and of course it looks rather bleak today, but originally, there were features very reminiscent of Graceland that we'll see reappear that Saunders had designed there. William Saunders, working with Swain Nelson, they do that original plan in 1860. What this diagram is attempting to show is that other designers become needed as the cemetery expands. So we'll see this expansion's 1871. This is up in the corner. This was a pioneer homestead. When Graceland bought it, they moved the house across the street and then incorporated that. This is the area that most people attribute to Simons. I'll talk about it later. And this is another distinct area where, if you've been to Graceland, you remember it because it's the area where the stones are flush to the ground. Thomas Bryan hires Jenny in 1877, and let's get going on this new plan. And I just highlight the word landscape gardening. And I show you this because it didn't make it into the book, but this is a map of where they dug up all the earth, basically. So they've hauled it at some distance to bring it to Graceland. How do we track and see? Here's 3 editions of the same map, and if you just follow this area, you can start to see the sequence in which all the plots were developed. Jenny does this very elliptical, I'd say more French picturesque roads, and the grading creates the lakes. Importantly, there were 3 lakes, not 2. So we have Lotus Pond down here, and so to split hairs as to who did what, Jenny comes in and gets all the grading, the roads, etc., and it's basically Simons who more or less somehow finagles a job from Jenny. Brian Lathrop takes over. Bryan leaves in 77 to be a commissioner of Washington, D.C. Lathrop gets the mantle. He soon gets rid of Jenny. Simons gets the job.